What do you think World War III is going to look like? Almost 40 years have passed since the culmination of the Cold War, and in its aftermath going well into the 21st century, international foreign policies have since prioritized geopolitical concerns over that of any singular country's national development. Globalism is the term commonly known throughout the world. For all its importance to us, the current structure we've been following ever since the 2020s began, and more recently in 2026, has faced opposing new shifts in the balance of prior governance established back in the 20th century. In 1993, when the Maastricht Treaty was ratified to make way for the European Union in response to Cold War conflicts, the EU's share of global GDP amounted to between 22.4% and 25.5%. In 2026, that number is down to 13.8% and 18.2%. This is just one factor of change. Membership issues, wars, and economic instabilities have all contributed to the perceptions of a weak Europe throughout the decades since. The continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less, says the current US administration under President Donald Trump. It is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies. These lines are sourced directly from the US National Security Strategy, or NSS, released only 2 months prior to reiterations made this year by Trump on the seizure of Greenland territory.
Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
There have been no shortage of wars this decade, and trade wars between close economic partners are no exception. The United States will prioritize commercial diplomacy to strengthen our own economy and industries, using tariffs and reciprocal trade agreements as powerful tools. In July 2025, an unratified trade deal between the US and EU was drawn up, marking a 15% tariff ceiling on EU goods, while completely removing all tariff duties levied to US industrial exports. The negotiations surrounding the deal have since been suspended following warnings made in January 2026 by Trump, stating that transatlantic commerce would come under 10% tariff hits, set to increase to 25% if a Greenland purchase were to be denied.
Et que le déficit commercial américain ne s'est pas résorbé. Donc, difficile de qualifier cette décision de la Cour suprême de mauvaise nouvelle. Maintenant, le président des États-Unis a annoncé une nouvelle vague de droits de douane. 10%. Puis 15% dans la nuit. De toute évidence, il y a quelque chose à réécrire, à reconstruire. Je le dis, entre deux partenaires commerciaux de premier plan, l'Union européenne et les États-Unis, aucun ne peut sortir gagnant de guerre commerciale.
Section 122, subparagraph A of the 1974 Trade Act outlines that for a period of 150 days, the US may proclaim any incoming articles under surcharges that don't exceed 15%, if it's in the president's judgment that these restrictions actually benefit the nation. This determination for quote-unquote broad and uniform application is repeated in subsection E. A month after these January warnings, on February 24, Washington imposed a 10% tariff under Section 122 on global imports, with a handful of domestically rare exceptions too critical to restrict for the US economy. This completely amended all previous executive orders related to foreign trade. Per various EU figureheads, tariff negotiations as of editing this video are still up in the air, and it's unknown if these new hits will be proclaimed by the US administration as surcharge to already existing sectoral tariffs. For example, the 50% rate levied to EU steel. On Washington's end, it's also unknown if further actions will be taken to bypass the limitations of Section 122 by invoking other legal measures found under Section 301 instead. This would subject any and all foreign trade policies to Washington's own federal investigations, before having the US government determine its independent policies in response.
We need it for national security, and that includes for Europe. And the problem is there's not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland. But there's everything we can do. We found that out last week with Venezuela.
Yet Europe remains strategically and culturally vital to the United States, says Washington and the NSS. Managing European relations with Russia will require significant US diplomatic engagement. And this emphasis on fierce diplomacy, so to speak, has since seen the US defer its contentions with Russia completely towards all those same exact NATO members denouncing his intentions of annexing Greenland soil. It's quite the confusing play. Though obviously met with disagreement from some nations such as Spain, NATO declared last year that each of its members would start to commit 5% of annual GDP on defense spending, up from 2% in 2014.
The 3.5% is to fund our militaries and the equipment they need, from our air defenses to ammunition, drones, tanks, troops, and more. The plan includes 1.5% of GDP that will go towards investment that support our defense and security.
Though NATO relations with Russia have deteriorated over the years since the start of the Ukraine war, much of what's described in the national security document holds the EU, or in a larger scope, Europe, capable of maintaining an economic and political foothold independent of Russian industries, as in the case of Germany. Its international commerce is directly mentioned by the states in the NSS, citing concerns over LNG trade with Russia. And though the percentage of Germany's imports from Russia has since dropped drastically from its previous high of 55% in 2021, the states nonetheless pointed to Berlin as a sore spot in these interests. Backed by research from Deutsche Umwelthilfe, a member of the European Environmental Bureau, federal contingent and gas company SEFA currently has a contract with Russia's Novatek set to end in 2038. And there's no doubt the US administration would highlight the estimates of LNG imports as something to remedy, which still amounted to a 9% share in Germany's total sector during 2023. Russian LNG in the EU went from 22.2% of total share to 15.2% between 2024 and 2025. In line with bloc diversification interests for energy supply, the EU Council has since submitted a regulation banning all Russian gas imports between 2026 and 2027, depending on the length of any existing contracts. It's still not clear if worldwide events such as those in Iran might further influence its ratification. For example, because the Strait of Hormuz has been largely inaccessible this year, Germany since set out to utilize 2.4 million tons of oil from its reserves to combat price volatility. The data you could extrapolate and apply from the policies of just one country to all these dynamics of modern-day Europe goes against Washington's plans of sustaining supply chains away from any external influence of war, or, well, any conflicts of US national interest at least.
Wir wollen eine neue transatlantische Partnerschaft begründen. Lassen Sie mich mit der unbequemen Wahrheit einfach beginnen. Zwischen Europa und den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika hat sich eine Kluft, ein tiefer Graben aufgetan. Und wir glauben nicht an Zölle und Protektionismus, sondern an freien Handel. Niemand hat uns in die übermäßige Abhängigkeit von den Vereinigten Staaten gezwungen, in der wir uns zuletzt befunden haben. Diese Unmündigkeit war selbstverschuldet. Aber diesen Zustand lassen wir jetzt hinter uns. Und zwar lieber heute als morgen. Das tun wir nicht, indem wir die NATO abschreiben. Wir tun es, indem wir im Bündnis, im eigenen Interesse, einen starken, selbsttragenden europäischen Pfeiler errichten.
As it so happens, the most recent Munich Security Conference from February of this year has re-established EU sentiment in opposition to US policies, citing Washington's belligerence regarding Greenland and its reluctance to provide aid directly towards the Russo-Ukrainian War as indicative of the true nature of the national security strategy. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, emphasized in her February speech the prevalent consensus throughout the bloc for an independent Europe, notably greater European assertion against Moscow. Even years prior to the advent of the current war, and years prior to Crimea's controversial 2014 referendum and annexation, the repeated failures from the EU to expand collaborative procurement benchmarks set all the way back in 2007 for military equipment have not just stagnated these joint measures, but have brought these countries down to below 20% of individual defense investment, when the roadmap had initially projected each member state to maintain a greater percentage at 35% for the past 19 years. A new roadmap presented in 2025, together with talks in the Munich conference from February this year, have both reiterated the need to finally reach these numbers and target an even higher range at 55% of individual defense investment going forward into 2030. But as we've seen, roadmaps can't be valued and worth by statistics and data alone, less even in speech. The fiscal differences among member states are also viewed as points of contention that may impede these shares of responsibility in both the defense of the EU itself against Russia and the execution of improved cross-nation policies to help the bloc stand as true geopolitical contenders against America. Regarding Washington's calls then for higher NATO investment in conjunction with aggressive US foreign policies, the EU has resolved to stifle what many have viewed as lenience on the region's behalf towards international factors.
Übrigens, etwas davon habe ich in den Gesprächen über Grönland gespürt, die wir in den letzten Wochen geführt haben. Und ich wende mich insbesondere an Mette Frederiksen, die dänische Ministerpräsidentin, die weiß, dass sie sich auf europäische Solidarität ohne jede Einschränkung verlassen kann.
As stated in the NSS, America First diplomacy seeks to rebalance global trade relationships. Commerce is one major component in EU geopolitics, and US strategy repeatedly outlines NATO's strength as ineffectual if it expands to include factors the alliance can't secure control over. Both sides would rather choose to bolster industries and friendly relations in which they'd maintain full jurisdiction and overview, whether economically, as in the case of the US's stance on America's domestic reindustrialization, or geopolitically, as in the case of Europe's stance on the current Greenland conflict.
The pressure on us is unacceptable. We all know the story, but I don't think it's only about us. This is not only about Greenland. Imagine a NATO country acquiring, taking, threatening an ally. Where would the world stand if that happened? We would be a puzzle in a big game, and what would prevent America, if they did that, USA and Russia and China, to split up the world in three big blocks if this was allowed?
Ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance also lies as a top priority for America as much as Europe concerns the NSS. With likewise interest in EU security, Ukraine's status as a political player in Europe has been funneled solely through its primary role in the Russo-Ukrainian War, and no developments have been made since 2022 to prioritize Kyiv's inclusion as a member state. Discussions from late 2025 involving the fundamental standardization of Ukrainian legal policies, economic policies, etc. in line with EU frameworks, as well as the promise of a €90 billion loan in Ukraine's defense spending, appear to make at least some groundwork for the country's accession to the EU bloc, only for this progress to be stalled during February 2026 by Hungary's veto of the loan itself, with Hungarian President Viktor Orbán citing, in due part, the country's conflict with Kyiv over oil supply issues. Interestingly, since March 2026, Hungary has been prohibited from accessing sensitive data in EU talks after accusations of wiretapping between Budapest and Moscow during previous council meetings. Evidently, internal matters in line with these new bloc policies have yet to be formalized on stable grounds. Even the EU itself has shown reluctance on its own terms in the development of this loaning problem, with numerous figures, including von der Leyen, failing to commit to a proper deadline for accession and attributing these changes to the overall complexity of admitting member states still embroiled in war.
The date you set is your benchmark that you want to match. You know that from our side, dates by themselves are not possible.
These capabilities and initiatives for defense have been observed by Russia and the US, as we've discussed, but the 20s have pushed the EU to a stance committed only to ensure security for the bloc as it exists now, and nothing else more concrete even to steady this wish for a guarantee.
In order to seek peace in today's world, Europe must be able to project power. In simple terms, we need to invest in means to protect our territory, our economy, our democracy, and this will be at the heart of our new European security strategy. From defense to data, from industry to infrastructure, from technologies to trade.
The geopolitical situation in Europe as of right now is one replete with ambiguity. Bloc constituents have so far spoken about the necessity of strengthening international relations while bolstering EU influence, security, and economy, but have at the same time shown increasing wariness, not in their commitment to improve by the instrument of their policies, but in opposition to various players against whom they've all but confirmed they remain reactive towards, rather than proactive. This weakness hasn't appeared clearer to them in the 21st century than it's been this decade, and the precarious position they now inhabit proves more and more vulnerable with every new shift in dynamic, not only as informed and pressured upon them by the US, by Russia, by Ukraine, but also internally by the issues of its differing populace. The EU as an entity seems less an independent variable here and more like a relic of the past, contending with factors it's been ill-equipped to handle by the decades it sustained for solidarity. There hasn't been a century in history in which Europe's been free from widespread strife. If any conflict has to come soon, we'd be way more safe in keeping a steady eye on those same parties that now encroach the bloc on economic grounds, political grounds, cultural grounds as well, and spare as much composure as we can should these grounds make way for new war. In Asia now, the greatest of powers given focus on the NSS is China, of course, with the United States directly regarding Beijing's developments over the decades as a result of 4 successive US administrations of both political parties, either willing enablers of China's strategy or in denial. Interestingly, the topic of China and its position towards Western dynamics can also be described with Germany's LNG concerns. 3 years ago, the total percentage of Chinese chemical exports to the EU reached as high as 60%, aided here and there by international partnerships between government corporations from both Berlin and Beijing, as well as the increase in capacity of related industrial sites. Plenty of Chinese companies also own valuable stakes in EU power operations, transmission, grid utilities and faculties, systems, even a 25% stake in Portugal's national electricity and natural gas grids. And while these economic relations are hardly anything new, especially in the context of Chinese enterprise, one of the more major difficulties as far as the US is concerned lies with Beijing's ability to, rather carelessly, subsidize its industries and manipulate the direction of sectoral markets. We can see examples of these trade conflicts building up to the modern day. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, functions like an arbiter between 2 different countries, as in the case of September 2012, where the Office of the US Trade Representative, or the USTR, called forth a WTO provision in its agreement on subsidy practices. They cited Article 10 to pursue countervailing offsets and uphold US domestic legislation, impose subsequent tariffs on China, and hold the country accountable for bypassing international law as fellow members of the organization. Different nations are beholden to the same legal coverage when operating overseas, and here, Washington disputed the influence of Beijing's Ministry of Commerce on American auto manufacturing, with claims surrounding a severe loss of market share on American soil, in its own markets, and against America's own populace. Though the US ultimately won the case, it was just one of many where the USTR has deferred legal complaints to the WTO in view of trade imbalances. The most recent one, at the time of editing this video, soon to be established after Washington's latest federal investigation into China's commercial practices, alleging forced labor, overextended manufacturing capabilities detrimental to ongoing operations, and the potential implementation of government subsidy programs. China's capacity to subsidize to this extent on an international level reflects more on its domestic markets, industries, and economies, and has shifted aggressively over the years in attempts to strengthen newfound national strategies. In the global context, this means Beijing seeks to become a dominant manufacturing force within science and technology sectors, relying little on other countries to sustain production. Subsidy programs targeting foreign investment comprised only 3.3% of the total central government share in 2021, after having dropped from 10% in 2001. Studies from American research organization CEPR also suggest that China's economic focus has achieved reliable consistency since 2017 in maintaining 0.8% of its GDP for subsidy allocation. The collective value of all this allocation has since shared, naturally, in the rate of growth of the entire country's GDP, and has surpassed more than $100 million in government investment following 2022 data. Like many of the growth dynamics observable in Xi Jinping's administration, the low value of manufacturing and tech subsidies allows Beijing to distribute upwards of 40% of allocation towards these sectors at 2.5% of the expense, while agriculture, though tallying only 17% of the allocation, takes up almost half of the expense. The supply and industrial chains of these sectors are also subject to policies dictating multiple steps of all resource management, from R&D to fiscal constraints. And as the US acknowledges in the NSS, along with the political back and forths that have taken place throughout this decade, there might exist the argument that the PRC's current economic systems just well integrated enough with its state to justify decades of government intervention, but the caveat remains complex. Accusations have been made in the past on behalf of the US, the EU, G7, and so on regarding similar incidents to USTR's 2012 case, in which China has been unable to provide any notable institution with acceptable records of government subsidies. Despite multiple requests to follow standards of methodology, to narrow legal definitions of government financial assets, to provide details within a local government scope on the effects of these subsidies per region, to disallow transfer of public investments or guidance funds to venture capital partnerships, etc., etc. And it's clear the true framework of these subsidies represents a minor factor in the PRC's broader scheme of alienating external influence in favor of economic bulwarks. A reportedly vast, but somehow still incomplete dataset curated by the Chinese Industrial Survey between 1998 and 2013 was discarded following the implementation of a complete and total restructuring policy issued in 2015 by the PRC, entitled Made in China 2025, a policy by which the consolidation of manufacturing and technology industries stood for Beijing as a top national priority going into the 2020s. It was no secret that all the country's effort would be going towards digitalized infrastructure models, as seen with Germany's Industry 4.0 tooling, and that international collaborations pursued by China would be used only for monetary or investment purposes, and not for political alliance. This is especially true of Beijing's practice acquiring either intellectual property or overseas tech in exchange for business relations, conducted together with financial government oversight. In retrospect, dismantling the Chinese Industrial Survey would be the natural conclusion for any government undergoing such an extensive economic maneuver, especially one with long-standing socialist markets to economize and enact likewise policies, all the way from establishing fundamental supply chains under the jurisdiction of a local province to requiring PRC-sanctioned quotients for R&D and sales, and by controlling what they call state-owned enterprises to provide Chinese manufacturers enough resources to build up their respective industries, or by allowing subsidies for the purchase of products from China alone and no other country. Beijing effectively bypasses all violations that could be held against them by the WTO. Brad Setzer, former advisor to the USTR, said it best. Is every state investment fund a subsidy? How do you prove that when state firms dominate the economy? China's heavy focus on manufacturing saw all government intervention from President Xi Jinping to funnel fiscal stimulus away from sectors like housing, pension, and imported goods, only to come up at the end of it all with insane numbers in export surplus and a depreciated yuan.
The variable that matters is not whether China is growing at 4 or 5. The variable that matters is China getting its growth from domestic demand, or is China essentially exporting its problems to the rest of the world? And my view it is that time for China to, basically take on the responsibility of generating the demand its economy needs for its economy to grow, which is something that President Xi has been very reluctant to do.
Yes.
The nationwide policies mentioned earlier, meant to limit international trade in favor of domestic growth, haven't yet provided much benefit in the way of their projections from 2015. And right now, the entire Asia-Pacific region has been badly hit by China's desperate attempts to alleviate these economic pressures, doing so with heavy price gouging. Domestic markets are currently standing on the precipice between cheap imports from a massive Chinese surplus and the prioritization of sovereign economies. Thailand now forecasts economic growth to decline by 0.4% from last year, while Indonesia's manufacturing contingent has stagnated, taking up only 19% of the country's GDP. America's NSS doesn't hold back at all in reiterating China's position as an economic threat. In February of this year, ambassadors from Bangladesh and the US met to sign a policy agreement focused on reciprocal markets, set to open discussion on possible opportunities in trade to take advantage of this new conflict. In 2024, a paper from Intereconomics cautioned against any strong intervention from the EU against Chinese government subsidies, pointing to the disastrous market consequences that would occur if the EU bloc were to oppose such an important production partnership and have Chinese imports restricted. On the other hand, the same paper argued that localizing EU production regardless by hitting back against distortive Chinese subsidies would benefit European markets and supply chain efficacy in the long run, which proved correct following a proposal last year from the EU to levy tariffs of 50% on any steel delivered over market capacity, thereby countering Chinese manufacturing surplus. US and Chinese movements against one another, especially in the Asia-Pacific region from this point on, should be viewed as a chain of geopolitical powder kegs, if only from an economic standpoint going forward. And speaking of that phrase, going forward, we will rebalance America's economic relationship with China, prioritizing reciprocity and fairness to restore American economic independence. The US writes in the NSS, and it would come to no one's surprise once these powder kegs spiral out to even harsher consequences for the two countries, namely in tech.
AI firm DeepSeek is aiding China's military and intelligence operations, a senior US official has told Reuters. Chinese law requires companies operating in China to provide data to the government when requested. But the suggestion that DeepSeek is already doing so could raise privacy concerns for the firm's tens of millions of daily global users.
Data and cloud computing were among the prerequisites for Chinese investments into artificial intelligence all the way back in 2015, much like US endeavors into the field at the time. If we're to observe and run down the list of sectors highlighted by China's State Council as part of the Made in China initiative, we can easily connect these priorities to the state of our world today: information technology, numerically controlled machine tools and robots, aerospace equipment, ocean engineering equipment and high-end vessels, electrical equipment, biomedicine, and high-end medical equipment. And now let's fast forward a bit. In 2023, a story went under the radar where Taiwan's National Communications Commission suspected 2 Chinese ships of severing internet cables connecting to an outlying island of 14,000 people. Nothing major. In 2024, weeks after Navy vessels from the Philippines and China collided in the West Philippine Sea following Chinese assault, Beijing updated its Coast Guard regulations permitting the apprehension of foreign vessels if these vessels were discovered navigating within Chinese waters, the demarcation of which has been viewed as one-sided and largely controversial for neighboring countries like the Philippines and Taiwan. In the same year, Jinping reiterated on state television the importance of cyber defense and security systems in the context of an increased military budget. The biggest topic by far in this region no doubt surrounds a potential hike in conflicts between China and Taiwan. 2023 saw Beijing update its military recruitment laws for the first time in 22 years in order to revamp and remedy the systems of the People's Liberation Army, allowing previous servicemen to easily assume old ranks and positions in the advent of war. Modified hierarchies in evaluating new conscripts were also introduced, placing college students at the top of the list. This comes as no coincidence, and as America's NSS outlines, a favorable, conventional military balance remains an essential component of strategic competition. There is, rightly, much focus on Taiwan, partly because of Taiwan's dominance of semiconductor production, but mostly because Taiwan splits Northeast and Southeast Asia into 2 distinct theaters. And where the Chinese military is concerned, state regulations and industrial capacity can always be improved upon when anticipating a surge in heightened tensions. High-ranking generals in the PLA have been purged by Jinping throughout the year under presumed faculties of modernization, and many analysts have agreed these unexpected dismissals build upon new streamlining frameworks initially established for the military during the earlier years of the decade. Whether it's to reduce systemic corruption, as claimed by PRC associates, or if it's to stave away any variables of disloyalty among rank, the fact remains that further influence in Chinese industries has been consolidated this year by the current PRC administration in accordance with those long-standing policies on manufacturing mentioned earlier. In 2021, the PRC was also heavily involved in repurposing Hong Kong's electoral systems for its own needs, and appointed hundreds of state representatives to legislative council seats for national security control. This is another example of China's willingness to contend with the governance of other political bodies. Beijing's resolution in these legislative matters came shortly after the country's crackdown on Hong Kong's 2019 to 2020 protests against the increase of state powers and intervention in judiciary overview. 6 years on, the objectives of these protests have effectively failed, with Chapter 525 of Hong Kong's legal ordinance making up apparatus for widespread PRC influence. Political bodies, faculties of market and commerce are all equally as important as one another as far as the country is concerned. China's latest parliamentary sessions have proven the state hasn't wavered at all in any of these matters, but is rather more entrenched in its strategies given the progress they've made on industrial capacity and technological prowess. New trade agreements signed in 2025 with Southeast Asian contingents made up some of the talk in these assemblies, reporting that cooperation with ASEAN would help to improve supply chain logistics and combat any poor implementation of protectionist rights, at least as perceived by China and its head of government, Li Chang. The actions of both Beijing and Washington in this region are fairly streamlined from first outset.
那第二个事实就是，我们也呼吁北京应该要正视客观的现在的这个事实，那就是中华民国依旧存在，而不是完全的忽略中华民国依旧存在的这样子的一个客观事实哦，然后片面的去解读说台湾是属于中华人民共和国的一部分。
Interest falls more towards what alliances may be created instead of strong-armed into diplomatic submission. But the general movements of these developments are influenced more by the potential that these same relationships may fall apart. And it seems no true commitment has been made on behalf of any party to maintain this cooperation if nearby conflicts test the governance of its comprising nations. Last year in 2025, the US and South Korea signed an industry and investments deal, which saw the purchase of $3 billion of LNG to Seoul, along with various deals on mineral supply chains, aircraft, and AI tech logistics. Yet South Korea was also among those included under investigation in March 2026 by Washington for the possible leveraging of new tariffs. In the same vein, the US also signed agreements with Japan for greater processes and stockpiles of minerals and rare earths, but the avenues of Tokyo's engagement with global markets are subject all the same to Washington's overarching economic strategies, even if these strategies result in vague and ambiguous declarations of wrongdoing on Japan's behalf. For another example of this public-facing ambiguity in Asia, as we'll call it, the US state studied DeepSeek's AI model and determined its use in Chinese military and intelligence ops to be a national security risk for public consumption, only to adopt similar technologies like Anthropic's models months later in military combat. America wants to keep Taiwan safe, but only for the importance of its shipping lanes and semiconductors. China, on the other hand, wants the Taiwan issue summarily resolved as well for the importance of political and cultural standing. The similar ways by which they fail to fully commit to friendly foreign policy can be observed no better than from an incident this March, where a trade deal between Washington and Taipei was finally signed to the purchase of anti-tank missiles, howitzers, Javelin missiles, and HIMARS for $11 billion, stalled previously by bipartisan disagreements in Taiwan about defense spending. After the US proposed the $11 billion deal towards Taiwan, China did not respond with diplomacy, but with reactionary aggression, sending 14 naval vessels in unprecedented proximity to Taiwanese maritime borders. In essence, China fought the sudden development between the US and Taiwan with an equally sudden development of its own, against all past measures and planning decades ahead into the future.
China's intense drills have also worried Taiwan's civilians.
China have their own idea of wanting to take us back. That's how it's been for a long time. But now we're different. We have our own country and our own way of thinking.
The circumstances in 2026 by which Asia has interacted with itself, with the US, and with the EU comes, at best, to supplementary detail with regards to long-term foreign policies, which are typically distinguished by, I suppose you could say, vague hopes and dreams at this point. To revert regulations provided to your country's military is one thing. To actively carry them out at the moment of execution only attenuates the effectiveness of its design. And the dangerous quality by which Asian doctrine in this day and age is fashioned will never truly establish peace if regarded with a geopolitical lens. Manufacturing industries and all related policies may improve an economy year on year. Military capabilities can modernize at steady rates for as long as days of peace are maintained, and technology can advance even quicker than either of these elements if the incentive for an advantage is identified via economic, political, and social logistics. But constant threats can just as easily turn into threats of constancy in the midst of external progress. And if something were to catch fire, the world would arrange the passage of its burning not anymore by years, but by days. Hello, we're Sagan Research, an analyst group focused on global events. Thanks for watching one of two documentaries based on the USA's national security strategy. Europe and Asia were the main subjects here, and the next topic is going to be focused on the Middle East. The research paper these two videos are adapted from will be uploaded to our website sagun.co, where you can find all sorts of informative rundowns on politics, economy, and so on. I suggest you keep us on your radar. We'll be coming out with more in the future. Till then.